The backstage air was cool, but it did nothing to stop the slow trickle of sweat down her spine. She stood very still, trying to become part of the dark curtain beside her. From here, she could see a slice of the auditorium, a sea of dark suits and sharp haircuts. The low hum of conversation felt like a physical thing, a wall of sound she would have to break through. This was the Global Tech Symposium, the biggest stage of her career, and she was utterly alone. Just an hour ago, her boss, the brilliant and charismatic face of their research team, had grabbed his stomach and turned a sickly shade of green. Food poisoning from a questionable airport sandwich. He'd looked at her, panic in his eyes. "You have to go on," he'd said, his voice strained. "You know the material better than anyone. You wrote the material." And that was true. For 3 years, she had lived inside the problem of neural network compression. While others slept, she'd been at her desk, her screen filled with lines of code that looked like digital poetry to her. She had found the elegant solution, the clever shortcut everyone said couldn't exist. But knowing something in the quiet of a lab and explaining it to the most critical minds in technology were two different worlds. She looked down at herself. Her simple professional dress felt suddenly all wrong. It was fine for a team huddle, but here it made her look like someone's assistant, a note-taker. She was young, and she knew her face still held a softness that people often mistook for inexperience. She had seen that look before, in meetings, the quick glance that moved past her to the older man in the room. The stage manager, a man with a headset and a clipboard, gave her a tight smile. 2 minutes, he whispered. His eyes were already looking past her, scanning for the next speaker. She clutched the clicker for her slides. Her presentation was a careful, corporate-approved deck. It was safe. It credited the team heavily. It used complex jargon to sound impressive. Her boss had loved it. But now, holding it, the file felt dead in her hands. It wasn't how she thought about the work. It wasn't the story. The announcer's voice boomed through the hall. Due to unforeseen circumstances, our next speaker will be presenting the groundbreaking work on Aurora Project's neural compression. He fumbled slightly with the pronunciation of her name, then gave up and simply said, "Please welcome a key member of the Aurora team." The applause was a brief, polite ripple. It was the sound of an audience being patient, not excited. She took a deep breath that didn't seem to reach her lungs and walked out into the blinding light. The stage felt enormous. The podium was a giant, dark wood monolith. She approached it, the click of her heels too loud in the sudden quiet. She placed her notes down, adjusted the microphone, and looked up. Hundreds of faces looked back. Near the front, she saw a famous venture capitalist checking his watch. A group of senior engineers from a rival company, men with beards and folded arms, stared at her with blank, assessing eyes. In the middle, people were already looking down at their own laptops, the blue glow lighting their bored faces. The weight of their disinterest pressed down on her. "Good afternoon," she said. Her voice, usually clear, came out thin and swallowed by the vast room. She cleared her throat. "Thank you. I'm here to discuss our framework for efficient deep learning deployment." She clicked the button. The title slide appeared, crowded with logos and names. She launched into the script. She talked about parameter optimization and computational bottlenecks. The words felt like cotton in her mouth. She was just reciting, not communicating. She moved to the next slide, a nightmare of complex equations and graphs. A few people in the front squinted, but most seemed to retreat further into their own thoughts. Then the laser pointer died. The little red dot that was supposed to dance across the graphs, guiding everyone's attention, simply winked out. She shook it, clicked it again. Nothing. From the front row, one of the folded arm engineers, a man with sharp glasses, let out a quiet, heavy sigh. It wasn't loud, But in the terrible silence of her struggling presentation, it was like a thunderclap. It was the sound of pure, undisguised dismissal. He leaned over and whispered something to his colleague, who smirked. Her mind went blank. The next term she needed, the precise piece of jargon, vanished. She stammered. It facilitates the silence stretched, painful and hot under the lights. She could feel her cheeks burning. She saw a woman in the third row offer a small, pitying smile. This was it. This was the moment they all expected. The stand-in who couldn't stand up. The young woman who cracked under pressure. The story they would tell would be about the boss who got sick, not the work itself. Her 3 years of obsession, her beautiful, elegant solution, was about to be drowned out by a single awkward silence. She looked down at her hands, gripping the edge of the podium. Her knuckles were white. Her carefully prepared, safe presentation was a prison. It was built for her boss's confidence, not for her understanding. In that second of panic, a strange calm washed over her. She had a choice. She could sink with this ship, or she could let it go. She let go. She looked up, not at her slides, but directly at the man who had sighed. Then she scanned the room, making eye contact with the board, the distracted, the skeptical Dot. She took a single step to the side, out from behind the towering podium. The movement was so deliberate, it caught a few eyes. She placed the dead clicker down with a soft, final tap. "Let's try this a different way," she said, and this time, her voice didn't ask for permission. It stated a fact. "All that," she said, nodding at the complicated graph still on the screen behind her, "is just a picture of a problem. Let me tell you the story of how we solved it." The room did not suddenly become quiet. The low rustle of programs and the tap of keyboards continued, but the rhythm of it had changed. A few people looked up, curious about this sudden shift in her posture. Most were still waiting for her to fail. She ignored the giant screen with its confusing graph. Instead, she walked to the very edge of the stage, as close to the audience as she could get. The lights were less blinding here. She could see their faces more clearly. "Imagine," she began, her voice finding a new, warmer tone, "you have a brilliant friend. This friend knows everything about growing the perfect tomato. Soil, sunlight, water, temperature, everything." A few people in the front row looked puzzled. Tomatoes? At a tech conference? The man with the sharp glasses raised an eyebrow. "But there's a problem," she continued, pacing slowly along the stage's edge. "To share his tomato knowledge, your friend needs to carry around a giant, heavy library. Hundreds of books. It's slow. It's exhausting. He can't move fast. That's our current AI. Brilliant, but too big, too heavy for most phones or small devices." She saw a woman in the fourth row stop typing and look up. The metaphor was simple, but it had landed. "For 3 years, my job was to help my brilliant friend," she said, tapping her own chest. "Not to make him less smart, but to help him remember what was truly important. To turn that giant library into a single, perfect, handwritten notebook." She turned and pointed back at the complicated graph on the screen. "All those lines and numbers up there? That's just us trying to weigh every single book in that library. It's necessary work, but it's not the story." She walked over to a blank part of the presentation wall, a smooth white space. "The story," she said, "is in the spaces between the words." She began to draw with her finger, even though nothing appeared. But her movements were so clear, so confident, that people could almost see it. "We didn't just remove books. We watched our friend think. We saw that for 90% of tomato problems, he only ever used 10% of his books. He kept reaching for the same trusted guides." She mimed pulling a book from a shelf, flipping through it. Her whole body was involved now. The stiffness was gone, replaced by a natural teaching energy. The other books? He loved them, but they were for rare, specific bugs no one ever saw. So we asked a brave question. What if we took those away? Not to forget them, but to trust that if that strange bug ever appeared, he was smart enough to figure it out again from the core knowledge he had left. A man in the middle of the hall nodded slowly, his chin resting on his hand. That was the scary part, she said, smiling slightly. It was a real smile, remembering the fear of that moment in the lab. Deleting parts of a creation that took millions of dollars and years to build feels like kicking the legs out from under your own child. What if it collapses? She paused, letting the risk hang in the air. The room was quieter now. The tap-tap of keyboards had almost completely stopped. But we did it, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing them to listen closely. We carefully removed the books he never used. And something amazing happened. Our friend stood up. He was lighter. He was faster. But he was just as smart. In fact, because he wasn't lugging that huge weight, he could run to help more people, faster. She turned back to face them fully, her arms open. That's it. That's the core of it. We found the AI's own perfect notebook. We listened to how it thinks, and we helped it let go of what it didn't need. She could see the change. The bored looks were gone, replaced by focus, by curiosity. The rival engineer's arms were no longer folded. He was leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, watching her every move. So, when we talk about a 90% reduction in size, she said, gesturing to a number that had been buried in her second slide, we're not talking about making something dumber. We're talking about making it more. Itself. A focused genius instead of a tired scholar. A hand went up in the back. It was a young man. But the accuracy loss in the tertiary functions? He called out. It was a technical, detailed question, the kind meant to test her. She didn't flinch. She took a step toward him. A great question, she said, and she sounded like she genuinely meant it. Those tertiary functions, the rare bugs. We found they weren't really lost. They were patterns born from the core knowledge. When we gave the system just a tiny hint, like showing it a single picture of that bug, it could rebuild the solution itself. It had learned the principle of problem solving, not just a list of answers. It was teaching it to fish, not giving it a fish. A murmur went through the crowd. This was a profound point. It shifted the goal from memorization to true understanding. She fielded 2 more questions quickly, easily, her answers clear and free of jargon. She was no longer defending her work. She was sharing a discovery. The energy in the room had completely flipped. The pressure was gone. In its place was a kind of hungry attention. They were following her now, on a journey she was leading. She looked out at them, this sea of faces that had seemed so hostile minutes ago. They were waiting for her next word. She smiled, a real relaxed smile. So, that's the story of the tomato genius and his little notebook, she said. The technical details are in the paper, but the heart of it is simple. Sometimes, to see what something truly is, you have to be brave enough to see what it is not. She gave a small, acknowledging nod, and the room, which had offered her only a trickle of polite applause at the beginning, now erupted into a solid, warm wave of clapping. It wasn't over yet, but she had done it. She had pulled them into her world. And in doing so, she had quietly blown their expectations apart. The sound of the applause was like a wall breaking. It wasn't just noise. It was a feeling, a warm wave that washed over the stage. For a second, she just stood there, letting it sink in. Her heart, which had been a trapped bird in her chest, now felt like it was beating in time with the clapping. She took a slow breath, and for the first time, the air felt light and full of energy, not heavy with dread. The clapping began to settle, But the quiet that followed was completely different. The earlier silence had been empty and waiting for her to fail. This new quiet was full. It was the sound of people thinking, leaning forward, their minds buzzing with the simple tomato story she had planted in their heads. You could see it on their faces. The bored looks were gone. The distracted glances at phones were over. Now they were looking at her, really looking, waiting to see what came next. She walked back to the center of the stage, her steps sure and calm. She didn't hide behind the podium. She stood in front of it, open to the room. Now, she said, her voice clear and carrying easily without strain. You might be thinking, that's a nice story, but show me the magic. How do you actually look inside the mind of something that thinks in numbers? How do you know which books your brilliant friend is really using? This was the moment to bridge the story to the science. She pointed back at the screen, at the complicated graph she had abandoned before. This messy picture, she said, is actually a map of attention. It's like putting a little tracker on every single book in that giant library. For months, we just watched. We gave our system thousands of problems, easy tomatoes, hard tomatoes, tomatoes with spots, tomatoes from different places. She mimed watching something, her eyes following an invisible path in the air. And we saw a pattern emerge. It wasn't random. The paths it walked through its own library formed trails. Worn, familiar trails to certain shelves, and other shelves covered in a light dust. A hand shot up in the middle section. It was an older woman with sharp, intelligent eyes. You're describing a pruning methodology based on activation pathways, the woman said. But traditional pruning loses coherence. The network becomes forgetful. The question was a challenge, but a respectful one. It came from a place of real curiosity, not dismissal. She smiled and nodded. You're exactly right. If you just rip out shells blindly, the whole structure groans and collapses. A genius forgets how to think. She clasped her hands together. So we didn't just remove, we rearranged, we consolidated. She used her hands to explain, bringing them together as if squeezing something precious. Imagine those 10 core books it always uses. We found they often repeated the same basic ideas, just in different chapters. So we helped it merge them. We created a single super clear master guide from the best parts of all of them. It's not fewer ideas. It's clearer ideas. She could see heads nodding. The woman who asked the question was writing something down quickly. Then, she continued, her excitement for the work starting to bleed into her tone, came the scariest and most beautiful part. The dusty shelves. We didn't just delete them. We turned them into recipes. She paused, letting the word hang there. We took the knowledge from those rarely used books, the solutions for the weird, rare tomato bugs, and we translated them. We turned big, complicated chapters into elegant, one-page recipes. And we attached those recipes to the core master guide. So now, if the system ever sees a hint of that strange bug, it doesn't need the whole heavy book. It just glances at the recipe. It remembers the pattern, not the 1,000-page manual. A young man near the front, who had been staring intently, suddenly blurted out, "So you're preserving functional memory through latent pattern encoding." He looked thrilled with his own understanding. She laughed, a genuine warm sound that surprised even her. "Yes, but let's just call it giving our genius a really good cheat sheet." The room laughed with her. The tension was utterly gone. They were collaborators now, figuring out a puzzle together. She decided to show them, not just tell them. She clicked a button, not to her old slide, but to a fresh, simple screen she had secretly hoped she might need. It showed 2 side-by-side videos. On the left, a complex AI model, huge and slow, gradually identifying objects in a blurry picture. On the right, her teen's compressed version. small and fast, doing the same task in a fraction of the time, with a tiny, efficient flicker of data flowing through a neat, simple diagram. The one on the left is thinking with the whole library, she said. The one on the right is using the notebook and the cheat sheets. The difference was stunning. It was visual proof of her tomato story. You could see the efficiency, the elegance. A low murmur of appreciation went through the crowd. She looked out at them. The famous venture capitalist was no longer checking his watch. He was typing furiously on his phone, probably to an associate. The group of rival engineers were huddled, whispering intensely, pointing at the screen. The man with the sharp glasses was looking directly at her, and his expression wasn't of judgment or boredom. It was of deep, professional respect. He gave her a single slow nod dot in that moment. She knew. She had not just saved the presentation. She had not just explained her work dot. She had taken something the world saw as impossibly complex and made them see the simple, beautiful idea at its heart. And in doing that, she had made them see her not as a last-minute replacement, but as the true architect of the idea. The quiet person in the lab who had listened so closely to the machines whisper that she heard a way to make it sing. The applause started again, louder this time, rising up to meet her on the stage. She stood quietly within it, feeling not like a speaker who had finished, but like a discoverer who had finally been found. The final wave of applause finally began to soften, dissolving into a busy, excited hum. The session moderator, a woman who had earlier looked at her with professional pity, now approached the podium with a wide, genuine smile. "Thank you for that extraordinary explanation," she said, her voice filled with a warmth that wasn't there before. "We have time for a few questions." A forest of hands shot up immediately, waving from every corner of the hall. The first was from the older woman who had asked the sharp question earlier. She stood, not needing a microphone. "Your consolidation process," she began, her tone now one of a peer seeking clarification. "How do you ensure the master guide retains the nuanced decision-making boundaries? Doesn't compression inherently blur the lines?" It was a deep, technical question, the kind that could sink a presenter who didn't truly own the material. But she felt no fear. This was her language. She took a step forward. "A brilliant question," she said, and she meant it. "It's the heart of the risk. Think of it like this. If you merge 3 recipes for tomato soup, you might lose the unique spice from each one, right? You get something bland." She held her hands apart, as if balancing 3 invisible bowls. "We didn't just pour them together. We taught the system to understand the why behind each spice. Why this herb works with this tomato, why that one doesn't. So the new single recipe contains the principle of spicing. It can then adapt, creating the right flavor for the specific tomato it sees. The line isn't blurred. It's become smarter, more flexible." The woman listened, her head tilted. Then she smiled, a real smile of understanding, and gave a satisfied nod as she sat down. "Elegant," she said, almost. The next question came from the young man who had been so excited. He was practically bouncing. The practical applications. For mobile health diagnostics in remote areas. The speed and size you showed. It's not just an improvement. It's a game changer. Is your team partnering with any field organizations? Her heart leapt. This was why she did the work. Not for the specs, but for the could-be. "Those conversations," she said, her voice passionate, "are our most important ones right now. We are in early talks with several groups. The goal is to put this not in the hands of more tech companies first, but into the hands of a community health worker with a simple tablet, helping them make faster, better decisions for people who need it." She saw people across the room scribbling notes. The venture capitalist was nodding vigorously. Then a new voice, calm and measured, came from the front row. It was the man with the sharp glasses, the one who had sighed. He stood up slowly. The room seemed to quiet a degree further, sensing the weight of the moment. "I have to admit," he began, and his voice carried easily. He looked at her, and his expression was open, direct. "When you began, I was skeptical. We've all heard claims of breakthrough compression that later don't hold up." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But what you've described isn't just a new tool. It's a new philosophy. Listening to the system's own logic, rather than forcing our brute force methods on it." He placed a hand on his chest. "I apologize for my initial dismissal. It was unprofessional. What you have here," he gestured to the screen, now dark, "this is the kind of thinking that moves the entire field forward. My team would be very interested in a deeper conversation." The silence that followed his words was profound. It wasn't awkward. It was filled with respect. An apology from a recognized expert in front of everyone was more powerful than any trophy. She felt a lump form in her throat, but she kept her composure. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but firm. "The best ideas often look simple in hindsight. We just..." Listened closely. The moderator, seeing the time, took one last question from the back. It was a student, his voice cracking slightly with nerves. "For someone like me, who wants to work on problems that matter, how did you find the courage to pursue such a different approach? Weren't you afraid to be wrong?" She smiled, a thoughtful, gentle smile. She remembered the long nights, the dead ends, the moments of sheer panic that it was all a beautiful mistake. "Courage is a strong word," she said. "For me, it was more like stubbornness. I just couldn't let the idea go. It felt too right. And being wrong?" She shrugged. "In this work, you're wrong most of the time. The trick is to not be afraid of the wrong turns. They aren't failures. They're the walls that show you where the hallway isn't, so you can finally find the door. This," she nodded to the stage, to the room. "This was just one door." The moderator thanked her, and the final thunderous applause erupted. It was long and standing. People were smiling, shaking their heads in wonder, already talking to their neighbors. As she gathered her things, her hands were steady. The stage manager, who had barely seen her, now rushed over. "Incredible. Just incredible. We'll have the video for you. There are several people who urgently want to connect at the reception." She nodded, thanking him. Walking off the stage, the bright lights fading behind her, she entered the dim coolness of the backstage area. The quiet was sudden. She could still hear the muffled roar of the crowd in the hall, like distant ocean waves. She leaned against a cool concrete wall for a moment, closing her eyes. She wasn't thinking about the job offer she knew would come, or the headlines. She was thinking about the student's question about courage. She thought of her small desk, the late-night coffee, the feeling of being on the edge of a discovery no one else could see. She hadn't found courage on the stage today. She had brought it with her. It was the quiet courage of deep understanding. All she did was finally open the door and let everyone else step inside and see what she saw. The noise from the hall wasn't just applause. It was the sound of that door, swinging wide open. The heavy door to the backstage area had barely clicked shut behind her, muffling the last echoes of the applause, when it swung open again. The noise from the hall rushed in, a wave of excited chatter and shuffling chairs. The first person through was the session moderator, her face alive with an energy that was completely new. That was historic, the moderator said, not bothering with a handshake, but instead placing a firm, excited hand on her arm. Absolutely historic. Don't go anywhere. There are at least a dozen people who need to meet you, starting with him. She nodded toward the door. The man with the sharp glasses was standing there, waiting patiently. He had a slight, awkward smile on his face, as if unsure of his welcome. The moderator gently guided her back toward the light. The moment she stepped back into the periphery of the stage, she was surrounded. It was not a crowd, but a small, eager circle. The man with the glasses stepped forward first. He extended his hand. "Again, my sincere congratulations," he said, his grip firm and warm. "What you've done, it reframes the problem. My name is Michael. I lead the Advanced Systems Group at Nexon Tech." He mentioned one of the biggest, most cutting-edge labs in the world. "I would be honored if you would consider joining us for a think tank next month. Or frankly," he added, lowering his voice slightly, "if you would simply have a coffee with me tomorrow to talk about where your mind is going next. We need that perspective." Before she could fully answer, the older woman who had asked the nuanced question was at her elbow. "Consolidation through principles, not just data," the woman said, repeating her own words back to her with reverence. "I've been trying to publish on a similar intuition for a year, but you've proven it. I'm Clara, from Stanford's AI lab. We must collaborate. Let me give you my direct contact." A business card was pressed into her hand. Then another. And another. The young, excited man from the audience was there, talking rapidly about mobile health networks in Southeast Asia. A journalist from a major tech publication was asking for 5 minutes for a comment. The venture capitalist simply handed her a sleek, embossed card with only a phone number and a name. "Call me when you're ready to talk about the future," he said, his voice calm but his eyes intense. "Don't wait too long." For several minutes, it was a blur of names, titles, eager questions, and shared ideas. The feeling was surreal. Just an hour ago, these same people wouldn't have recognized her in the hallway. Now, they were seeking her opinion, her insight, her genius. The word hung in the air, unspoken but felt. She handled it with a calm she didn't know she possessed. She nodded, she listened, she thanked them, and she promised to follow up. Her mind, however, was drifting through the crowd, past the circle of suits, searching for one person. She finally excused herself, saying she needed a moment. She moved through the thinning crowd in the main hall, people still clustered in groups, animatedly discussing her talk. She heard snippets. The tomato analogy, so simple. Latent pattern encoding was the key. She's the one who actually invented it, not the boss. Then she saw him. Her boss. He was standing near the exit, looking pale but clean, having clearly rushed from his hotel room. He was staring at a live stream replay on someone's tablet, watching her presentation. His expression was unreadable. She walked up to him. He looked up, and for a long second, they just looked at each other. The noise of the hall faded into a background hum. She saw a storm of emotions in his face. Shock, awe, a flicker of something that might have been regret, and finally, a deep, undeniable pride. He closed his eyes for a brief second and shook his head. When he opened them, they were bright. I watched most of it from the hotel," he said, his voice still a bit weak. "I have never, in my 20-year career, I have never seen anything like that. You didn't just give my talk." He paused, swallowing hard. "You rewrote it. You rewrote everything." He stepped closer, putting a hand on her shoulder. "They didn't see me up there today. They saw the real thing. They saw you." He smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "The company is going to go crazy. In the best way. You know that, right?" She nodded. She did know. Life was going to change. Later that night, alone in her quiet hotel room, the adrenaline finally began to ebb. The stack of business cards sat on the desk like a deck of winning cards. Her phone buzzed constantly with notifications, emails, LinkedIn connections, messages from colleagues who who had seen the clips online. She stood by the window, looking out at the glittering city lights, a world that now seemed to know her name. She thought about the journey, not the last hour, but the last 3 years. The invisible work, the solved problems no one had celebrated, the certainty in her own mind that she had found a beautiful truth, long before anyone else could see it, not the hidden genius the title spoke of wasn't something that had appeared magically on that stage. It had always been there, in the quiet focus, in the stubborn belief, in the willingness to see a problem as a story waiting to be told. The stage didn't create it. The stage simply turned on a light, and for the first time, the world had looked in the right place and gasped at what had been there all along. She wasn't a different person. She was the same person who understood tomatoes and notebooks and the spaces between. That afternoon, with her heart thumping in a completely new way, she climbed the narrow, creaking stairs to the old wing of the music building where the composer had his private studio. The door was slightly ajar. She knocked softly. "Come in." His studio wasn't what she expected. It wasn't a grand, impressive space. It was small, a little messy, and wonderfully alive. Books were piled on every surface. Scores were open on a large desk, covered in penciled notes. On a stand in the corner was a beautiful, old violin, not a piano. The air smelled like old paper, coffee, and wood-polished. The composer was at his desk. He looked up when she entered, and for a brief second, she saw the same man from the masterclass, proud, guarded. But then his expression softened into something more like relief. "You came," he said, as if he hadn't been sure she would. He gestured for her to sit in the chair opposite him. Between them, on the desk, he had placed the first 2 pages of his manuscript, the ones she had played from. Next to them, he placed the blank page she had brought. For a long moment, they just looked at the pages. The unfinished story. "I have tried," he began, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room, 100 times to fill that page. 100 different endings. Loud ones, complex ones, clever ones. He shook his head, a look of deep frustration crossing his face. "They were all lies. They were what I thought the piece should be, not what it was. You played the truth in less than a minute. I have been fighting this music for a decade." He wasn't just talking about the piece. She could hear it in his voice. He was talking about a struggle much bigger than a few pages of notes. "Will you show me?" he asked, finally. Not as a teacher, but as a student himself. "Will you show me how you found the way out?" So she did. Not at a piano, but there at his desk, with the pages between them. She opened her own notebook, the one she always carried, filled with her neat, analytical handwriting. She showed him her maps, charts of his chord progressions across his other works, notes on his rhythmic habits. She had traced the falling pattern from that third measure, not just through this piece, but through a string quartet he wrote 15 years ago, and even in the middle movement of his second symphony. "You see," she said, her finger connecting dots across time, "it's not a random idea. It's one of your voices. Your musical voice. You use it when you're feeling." She paused, searching for the right word, unsure or searching. It's a question mark in musical form. And in this piece, you never turned it into a period. You just left the question hanging. The composer listened, his eyes wide. He was seeing his own musical soul, laid out in graphs and notes, understood with a clarity he had never applied to himself. It was humbling and exhilarating all at once. "So the answer," she said, pointing to the blank page, "wasn't to invent something new. It was to remember the question, and to let it finish falling." He picked up a pencil, his hand hovering over the blank page. "Show me," he whispered. She took her own pencil. Carefully, not on the precious blank page, but on a scrap of paper, she wrote the 3 notes. She wrote the simple, quiet resolution. She showed how they connected directly back to that forgotten fragment in the first measure. Completing a circle that had been broken for 10 years. The composer copied the notes onto the official blank page. His handwriting steady now, not frantic. As the last note was placed on the staff, he let out a long, slow breath, as if he had been holding it for years. He stared at the now completed page. It wasn't flashy. It was modest, almost shy. And it was perfect. "It's so simple," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It was always simple," she replied gently. "You just made the labyrinth around it so complex, you couldn't see it anymore." From that day on, their relationship changed. He didn't offer her empty praise or a fancy title. He offered her work. Real collaborative work. He asked for her help editing a new set of compositions, valuing her detective's ear for his own hidden patterns. He recommended her for a prestigious research grant, not out of pity, but because he wrote in his recommendation letter, "She is the first person to truly listen to my music in 20 years. The young woman finished her degree, but her path was no longer a straight line. She became a specialist in something rare and valuable, the psychology of unfinished music, helping performers and scholars understand the ghosts in incomplete manuscripts. She gave a famous talk using the story of Labyrinth's echo as its heart, and what of the piece itself? The composer published it at last, a decade late. On the cover page, below the title, were 2 names. His own as composer, and hers, credited with realization and completion. It was now performed by pianists all over the world. The legend of its impossibility was replaced by a better legend, the story of its healing. The famous composer never became a warm, cuddly teacher. He was still sharp, still demanding. But he never used that piece to humiliate a student again. Instead, he would sometimes tell the story. A story about a young woman who taught him that the greatest skill isn't in building higher walls, but in having the humility to listen for the door. Years later, at her first major professional lecture, she saw him in the audience, sitting in the back row. He gave her a small, firm nod. After the talk, he waited until the crowd around her had dispersed. He approached her, and in his hand, he held the original frantic, ink-blotted manuscript pages, now framed under glass. "This," he said, handing it to her, "should belong to the person who heard what it was meant to be, not to the person who was too proud to finish it." She tried to refuse, but he insisted. She kept it not in her office, but in her home, as a quiet reminder. A reminder that knowledge is not a shield to hide behind, but a light to see with. That preparation is a form of respect, and that sometimes the loudest victory comes from the quietest understanding. The impossible piece was now possible, and in completing it, she had not broken the great composer. She had, in a strange way, set them both free.